Hey, so welcome to the screencast on primary productivity, which is a huge deal in this unit. Sorry, this one I don't have a lot of the pretty pictures I usually put in. I just want to make sure I get this done before I leave for the summer. But let's get on it because primary productivity is a big deal in environmental science. All right, so basically, what is it? It's essentially the rate at which light energy from the sun gets converted into chemical potential energy in the form of sugars through the process of photosynthesis in green plants. So basically, green plants, you probably remember this from biology, they have chlorophyll. And, these are talking about plants, protists, bacteria, whatever. Anything that has chlorophyll in it is able to take light from the sun and capture it through the process of photosynthesis and then store that energy in glucose molecules. So the basic equation, which, by the way, you do need to memorize this, is carbon dioxide, easy enough to remember, you breathe it out, plus water, easy enough to remember, you drink it, plus light energy from the sun. Together, these things drive a reaction that stitches these together to form a high energy compound called glucose, and then there's leftover oxygen. And we're not even going to bother to balance it right now. This isn't a chemistry class, but the basic you got to know is low energy molecules, carbon dioxide, water, add some light to them, you end up with a high energy molecule called glucose. And this is basically the molecule of life. This is what makes life possible on our planet. All right, now, before we go any further, let's just reiterate what our last screencast was, and that is the two important rules of nature here. Okay, the one is called the first law of thermodynamics that says we can't create or destroy energy. However much energy we start with is how much energy we end up with. So if the sun is sending 1,300 joules per second per square meter of Earth's surface, well, that's the maximum amount of potential energy that could be captured, right? And the second law of thermodynamics says, like, hey, no matter what you do, some of the energy is always going to get converted to heat. And so as we start looking at these biological systems, this is going to be an important feature in what happens to this captured solar energy. Okay. So basically, the energy that comes in is stored in this molecule here, and energy can't be destroyed, so it has to be stored somewhere. It's stored in this molecule here. So you need to think of sugar molecules as being energy storage molecules. And they look like this, right? So we write it as C6H12O6. Again, you need to memorize this. It actually looks like this. You don't need to know that. But it is worth noting that plants, they generate this during photosynthesis, but then they convert it into starches, which allow them to store it for longer. Or they could take these starches and put them together to make things called cellulose, which basically is what wood is. All of these things basically represent these sugar molecules stitched together in different ways. They can also convert them into lipids like fats, proteins, and other things like that. Sometimes we use a catch-all term. We call them photosynthetic compounds, just basically carbon compounds that have a lot of energy in them that was originally captured from the sun. Now, why bother capturing all this energy? Well, the reason you do that is to be able to release that energy, because every cell and every organism on the planet needs a continual supply of energy. Just like a toy that needs a continual supply of energy from a battery, so too is true for every single cell. And the way they get it is through cellular respiration. And there's different types of respiration. We'll talk about them later in the year, but for right now, we'll just talk about aerobic respiration. So in aerobic respiration, what happens is essentially the exact opposite of photosynthesis, which was carbon dioxide plus water plus energy equaled glucose and oxygen. It's just the opposite. Glucose, food, plus oxygen breathed in, releases energy and converts the compound into carbon dioxide and water. So if you can memorize photosynthesis, you just flip the arrow around and now you've got respiration. But this is basically why plants engage in photosynthesis in the first place, so they can release this energy. Essentially, plants make their own food and then eat their own food. The rest of us have to eat the food that plants make. So we call plants primary producers because they are the first ones to produce these sugars, and the rest of us are the consumers of that. More on that in future talks. So primary productivity, therefore, is the fabrication of these carbon compounds through photosynthesis in a system. So primary producers, they make all the sugars and starches and lipids that then are available to support every other organism in an ecosystem. So this primary productivity is important because the amount of sugars captured by these plants puts a limit on how much life can exist in a given area of the Earth's surface. So when we talk about it, we talk in terms of gross productivity and net productivity. So gross primary productivity is basically the rate at which sugars are produced in a given ecosystem. Okay, so basically under normal circumstances, about 1.5% of the light energy that comes down and hits the ground is converted into sugars by plants. And so that's what our gross productivity is going to be. Gross GPP, we call it, gross primary productivity. How do we go about measuring that? Well, we're going to measure it in terms of how much energy per square meter per unit of time, right? So if you think, so how many joules of energy are captured in a given square meter of Earth's surface in a given amount of time? So that means we could measure in terms of, say, joules per square meter per second, or we could talk in terms of kilojoules per square meter per day, or we could even talk in terms of kilograms per square meter per year if we're talking biomass, which we'll get to in a minute. But these are all ways of measuring how much energy is captured per given unit of area per given unit of time. Now, GPP, gross primary productivity, and net primary productivity can be measured in terms of I skipped over net primary productivity when I hit my button wrong. Okay. So net primary productivity, or NPP, is essentially just gross primary productivity, how much sugars was captured, minus how much the plant had to breathe up through respiration. So plants, remember, they make their own food. That's gross primary productivity. Uh, and then they consume it themselves. They eat the food they made and they respire. And the leftover is what we call the net primary productivity. And that's what's available for every other organism in an ecosystem. So the way we mathematically is quite simple. It's NPP, so that's the net, is equal to the GPP minus however much was lost through the plant's own respiration. So think of it this way: under ideal conditions, about 1.5% of the light energy that hits the surface is captured as GPP by the plants. But they got to live, right? They got to eat this energy that they've been capturing. So it turns out about 0.5% is used up by plants to respire, leaving 1% left over. So that 1% is called the net primary productivity, or NPP, of the system. So now, both GPP and NPP can be measured in the same terms, right? And there's different ways you can measure it. But basically, how do you go about measuring? And remember, in both cases, it's how much energy is captured or is available per unit of area per unit of time. But how do you go about measuring that? Well, there's different ways you could do it. One is by measuring the amount of oxygen that's added to a system. Photosynthesis adds oxygen to a system. Respiration takes it out. So the net increase in oxygen over time is one way of measuring net productivity. Another way you can measure it is in terms of carbon dioxide removed from a system, because during respiration, we're taking it out. During photosynthesis, we're taking carbon dioxide out. During respiration, we're putting it back in. And so by measuring the change in CO2 of a system, we can get an indication of what the GPP and NPP are. And then probably the best way, though, is through biomass. Biomass is just those photosynthetic compounds we talked about. They accumulate. So whatever's left over after the plant eats the food that it makes, the leftover sugars and starches and lipids, they're still in that plant. And so measuring the amount of mass present is usually one of the best ways of measuring the net productivity of a system. So, as I said, NPP is often measured in terms of biomass. It's worth noting that biomass has to be a dried mass, so it's a little bit difficult to measure in a living system, because you really have to dry out and get rid of all the water, because that water doesn't contain energy. It's those photosynthates, it's those sugars and starches and cellulose and lipids. So basically, but that's what wasn't used for respiration. That's what's left over. That's what herbivores are going to eat, and then carnivores are going to get. So everything in a biologic system depends on this NPP that's present in the form of biomass. So that's a great way of measuring. So biomass is just mass. We can measure in terms of grams or kilograms. And so if we're going to talk in terms of the net primary productivity of a given ecosystem, we'll often talk in terms of kilograms per square meter per year. We're just saying how many kilograms of biologic matter were accumulated per square unit of area, say square meter, per unit of time, say a year. And it's worth noting then that we can basically equate kilograms of biomass to joules, right? So basically 1 kilogram of biomass is essentially equal to 14 kilojoules of energy. So you just think 1 kilogram biomass equals 14 kilojoules of energy. Now, GPP and NPP of an ecosystem are often things that are limited by the availability of certain things. So we call these things that can be in limited supplies limited factors. So the limiting factors that most often put caps on the productivity of a given ecosystem are light, uh, temperature. If it's too cold, you can't have photosynthesis. If there's not enough light, you can't have photosynthesis. Precipitation, water is a crucial part of the equation for photosynthesis. And the other one is nutrients, because you can't build cells if you don't have nutrients. Nutrients basically come down to things like nitrogen and phosphorus, things that are essential for constructing amino acids, nucleic acids that you can't build cells without. So even though you have everything you need to do photosynthesis, you can't grow, you can't add on to the mass of a plant if you don't have these other nutrients to do it. So these things, these four factors, these four limiting factors often place limits on the productivity of systems. All right, so let's just see how that would come into play. So let's talk about a terrestrial environment, a terrestrial ecosystem, like say a forest or a grassland area. So the NPP is typically going to be highest as we move towards the equator. Why? Well, because the sunlight is stronger, so sunlight becomes less of a limiting factor. We move towards the poles, light gets weaker, it becomes a limiting factor. Also, as we get towards the equator, temperature is never going to be a limiting factor. There's never a time during the year where it's too cold for photosynthesis to occur. But when you get even as far north as here in Korea, in the wintertime it's too cold. The plants are frozen. There's no photosynthesis possible. So that puts a limit on how much productivity can occur. Water is another big one, right? In places where there's a lot of precipitation, you're going to get a lot of plant growth. But if there's not a lot of precipitation, think about a desert, you just can't do it. Even if you might have light, you might have temperature, but if you don't have water, you don't have photosynthesis, you don't have productivity. So at higher latitudes, where you have weaker light, you have shorter days, you have colder, cold, below freezing in the winter. That really limits the amount of productivity that's available in those regions. Let's talk about aquatic environments. Okay, so in the oceans, obviously, they never freeze over, except at the poles. So temperature is usually not a limiting factor. Water is certainly not a limiting factor in an aquatic environment. What typically is, though, however, is nutrients. So nutrient availability is huge in these systems. So if you don't have nutrients, you can't build cells, and you can't have NPP. You can't build up photosynthetic compounds if you can't build them in the first place. So what we find then is, where is the productivity going to be highest in, say, a marine ecosystem? Well, it's going to be where the nutrients are. So where are the nutrients going to be located? They're mostly going to be located near the shores, brought in by rivers. So then we'll talk about this later in our unit, but basically rivers collect a lot of biologic matter, the decomposed matter that have these nutrients in them, and they tend to dump them in the estuaries at the mouths of these rivers and in the nearshore environment. And so we find productivity tends to be highest there. If you move offshore into the deeper ocean areas where the water turns very blue, there's a lot of light, there's a lot of water. You'd think you'd have a lot of photosynthesis, but you don't, because you don't have much in the way of nutrients, so you can't build cells. Now, there are places in the ocean where we have a thing called upwelling. We'll talk about it a bit this year. And that just basically means we're bringing up nutrients from down below where they sank, and then we bring them back to the surface, and you get a lot of productivity there. So the last thing we have here is just a look at just a comparison. So you see in a tropical rainforest, it's the most productive systems on the planet because you have strong light, lots of water. There's nutrients, and so you're able to have a lot of productivity. An estuary is basically where the river meets the sea. Again, it's going to be basically just as productive. But if you compare like a savanna, like in Africa has the same amount of sunlight and warmth that a rainforest has. What it doesn't have, though, is water. So when you limit the water, you get a significant decrease in productivity. And if you limit it a lot down to a desert, you get even more so. All right. Now let's take a look at then. You know what? I'll let you read this one. I'm done. I'm going home for the summer. I'll see you guys later. Have a great. Well, you had a great summer, I hope. I bet I had a great one. Anyway, thanks for watching.